So let's actually look at this sort of distorted perception, if you will. I mean, and you know, I invite all panelists to sort of jump in on this. Why is it that there is this distorted perception? So, I mean, my favorite example of this is, you know, one of our key initiatives at the ISB is around affordable housing. I've had many conversations with real estate players, you know, in this country where they express an interest in affordable housing as well. And then you ask them, what is affordable housing? And they tell you it's 25 lakhs to 30 lakhs. I mean, there is clearly a reality distortion effect going on, because if you actually do the numbers of, if it's a 25 lakh rupee house, if you, let's do some, you know, random number crunching. They're talking about what, 25,000 rupees EMI per month, which means that if you use rule of thumb, you need an income of about 12 lakhs to 15 lakhs a year. Now, who in this country actually makes that kind of money? So there is clearly some sort of reality distort that is going on, and that actually influences everything else that I see. I mean, it influences the venture capital community, the sort of investments the venture capital community goes after. So actually, let me sort of step back and just ask the panel the question. I mean, what role do you think the media plays in all of this? Because to me, this breathtaking coverage of India, especially in the newspapers that come out of the Times staple, there's an enormous amount of breathtaking news that's happening. Is this actually for real? I mean, what role does the media really play in distorting our own perception of our own country? Any of you can feel free to jump in. Atanu?
Hi. I suppose there is a very good reason why, in some sense, the newspapers have to sell, and the people who are reading the newspapers have to feel good about themselves and say, okay, we are doing really well. That's why you could get a distorted view of what's actually happening. I would take another track over here, and I'd like to point out that the liberalization of the Indian economy was begun sometime in the mid-80s, and 1991 is when the actual some serious changes were made to the macroeconomic policies, especially trade and some other things, which changes that really didn't affect the people broadly. They were the kind of things that would have affected the industries and the manufacturing sector, but there were no major changes in the other sectors, and therefore the growth that happened was sort of biased towards the manufacturing sector. Now, real growth has been, there has been real growth in the economy, and therefore there's been an opportunity for development to occur. And we can always decry the fact that things have not helped the vast majority, the 800 million that we are talking about. It's also good to remember that what would have been the counterfactual? Suppose we had not had this limited liberalization itself. Would we have been better off or not? My contention is that we would have been really much worse than what we are today. Another thing I'd like to throw out to the panel and to the audience is that there's a lot of talk about inclusive growth. I'm not sure I fully understand what inclusive growth means, but I know that this word inclusive, this phrase inclusive growth is used by the Prime Minister in many of his speeches. And he holds the private sector responsible or makes it feel guilty that it has not done enough. And I kind of find that to be, I feel uncomfortable when the government has failed on the job that it's supposed to do, and then says that, well, the private sector is responsible for this thing, and they have to do things so that growth trickles down, otherwise there's going to be social unrest and revolt and so on. And I think that's disturbing, the fact that the government is pointing fingers at somebody else for its own failures.
I think, Ruben, your question about media playing a role. My own understanding, and this is what I've been thinking for the last a few years, watching from the US about this whole India growth story. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, there's so much capital which has been out there chasing for a return, and with developed world becoming more mature, they were looking for home. And with all these other things which are happening, like the trust of India was going high because a lot of entrepreneurs in the US have done extremely well in the US, and so that coupled with need for finding new markets for growth, media kind of took on Indian-China story as the story, right? So the positive aspect of that story was this capital which has flowed into the country, and there are some fundamentals which are supporting the flow of capital into the country. I think what is interesting, what Mudit is talking about, is there are a lot of other challenges which need to be solved in India in the context of the broader 800 million people. And so the question is defining those challenges and how can market-based solutions, along with public policy support and all the wonderful people sitting here in the room, their energy, their passion, of wanting to build great businesses, if all can come together and media also steps up, like we could use the same energy to solving these problems. So this is kind of more optimistic view of the question of media.
I'll just add to that. I was reading the Mint newspaper yesterday. It was the National Readership Survey, and I guess there's the media industry drives off of advertising revenue, and it's a 20,000 crore industry. Period. Of that, 50% of the spend is in print. Now the irony is that print, the most widely read newspaper in this country, touches only 12 million people. The most widely read Hindi language paper touches 20 to 30 million people. So the tragedy is that, despite the fact that we think we have the largest print sort of circulation in the world, the tragedy is it touches very few people. Now on the other hand, the phenomenon of television has created 100 million households. And there are brands like Baba Ramdev that have been built in the last 5 years. So I think to your point, if you can get the message right, there is a vehicle that exists now called television that can reach hundreds of millions of homes. So I think we do need to focus on what we want to get, what we want to say, and then the vehicle does exist. 20 years ago we only had Krishi Darshan, right? You fast forward today, maybe we need a new Krishi Darshan.
Sure. But let me just go back to, and I'll address this question straight to you, which is, so why do you think there is this, so when I say, when you take the example of housing again, right? Why is it that a real estate company thinks that 25 lakhs or 30 lakhs is affordable housing?
I think there is clearly, the challenge of creating return within a given time frame. Most of us as fund managers are measured on an IRR basis. Now the tragedy is that we're only measured in 7 and 10 year windows. And so anything that we do has to satisfy that return profile.
Sure.
So unless we're measured differently in terms of impact that we create on an environment, and therefore the impact of that, we're going to be tied to essentially returning economics. And oftentimes the economics on low-income housing are not as clear to folks who have done it before.
Right, but that might well be because they've never investigated the option, right?
Absolutely.
Because, we can, the numbers that we are seeing in terms of IRRs are between 40 and 50%.
So
on a market where there's a 40 million demand, households.
Absolutely. So I think most investors actually are going for low-hanging fruit. And they're saying, look, fundamentally, there's above the 800 million, there's 200 million. So why don't we just solve their problems first, and we'll get down to the 800 million 20 years from now. So it's a travesty, but that's the unfortunate reality that most money for this kind of work comes